Diputado general, diputada foral, autoridades, conferenciante, tía Mariana, señoras y señores, muy buenos días, egun on danori. Como decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas y Empresariales de Deusto Business School, agradecerles su asistencia al Bizkaia Startup Bay con motivo de la conferencia de la prestigiosa economista Mariana Mazzucato, organizada por Deusto Business School en colaboración con la Diputación Foral de Bizkaia y con Deusto Business Alumni. Para todos nosotros es un gran honor poder contar con la profesora Mazzucato, que compartirá con todos nosotros las claves de la innovación en las administraciones públicas. Antes de proceder a la presentación de la ponente y a darle paso a su intervención, cedo la palabra al diputado general.
Bueno, egun on guztioi, eskerrik asko benetan onera etortzeagaitik. Aurreneko aldiz, lehengo asuntu bezala, eskertu nahiko neuke zelan ez Deusto Business Schooleri, presidentean dan Agustineri eta baita ere dekanoa dan Albarori, eta esaiozue baita ere errektoreari, nire partetik, haulakoak gurekin bat posible egitearen, eskerrak emoten dautxua desala. Good morning to you all. Egun on guztioi izan bezala. In Euskera, in our Basque language, ongi etorri means welcome. So ongi etorri, Mrs. Mazzucato. Welcome to Bizkaia, welcome to Bizkaia. And thank you very much for being here. It is an honor. You know that it is an honor. For me personally, it is a dream come true. I'm very grateful to you for accepting the invitation I extended to you in London. And I'm also grateful to you for accepting Bizkaia as one of the founding members of your global network, the MOIN network. Not only it is an honor, it is also a dream come true and an opportunity for all of us to learn, to improve, and to grow. And that is the main thing today. So thank you for helping us to improve. I want to be, and I will be very brief, for two reasons. I'm here to introduce you, but you need no introduction. As the Times reported, you are the world's scariest economist. Many times, very often, you hear that. But what more can I say? Simple that for me, you are a guiding light, someone who should be listened to carefully, very, very carefully. I should like to end with a reflection that dates back 500 years. In 1519, a Basque shepherd called Juan Sebastián Elcano set out on a great adventure. He dared to think outside the box, to think differently, to act differently. And that is how he managed to sail around the world, the first circumnavigation of the globe, the very first. We Basques have always had inquisitive minds, and we need to continue being inquisitive. We need to continue thinking outside the box. We sometimes think that we only need machinery to improve and grow, software, apps, experts, laboratories. That might be partially true. Yes, we can also grow and learn by asking questions, thinking differently, responding differently, and of course, acting differently. If we simply repeat ourselves over and over again, we will simply record the same outcome over again and again, and nothing will change. There are very important questions to be answered, and we need to hit such answers. And we need to accept the decisions those answers entail. What kind of world do we want to live on? What kind of world do we want to leave to future generations? How can we create value through the public sector? What is value? What is progress? I shall not take up any more for your time, Professor. We are grateful for your presence here and for enabling us to know. Thank you very, very much. Eta beste guztioi ere, zelan ez, eskerrik asko gurera etortzeaitik, esposaketa ona etortzeaitik, orain Mazzucato hori itxiko dautzogu, aurretik aurkezpen bat egongo da, eta, bueno, esan bezala, aprobetxa dezagun gaurko egun hau zerbait ere ikasteko. Mila esker guztioi.
Pasamos a presentar brevemente a la profesora Mazzucato, que por deferencia a ella lo haré en inglés. Professor PhD Mariana Mazzucato holds the chair in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value, University College of London, where she's establishing a new Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose launched in autumn 2017. Her highly acclaimed book, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, was on the 2013 Books of the Year list of the Financial Times. It focuses on the need to develop new frameworks to understand the role of the state in economic growthland. Professor Mazzucato is winner of the 2014 New Statement Sperry Prize in Political Economy, the 2015 Hans Moffatter Prize, and in 2013 she was named as one of the 3 most important thinkers about innovation in the New Republic. She has advised policymakers around the world on innovation-led growth and is currently a member of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisers, the World Economics Forum's Council on the Economics of Innovation, and the Finnish Innovation Fund Advisory Panel. Her research focuses on the relationship between financial markets, innovation, and economic growthland, and how to allow smart, innovation-led growth to be also more inclusive and sustainable. Mazzucato is co-editor of the book Rethinking Capitalism, Economics and Policy for Sustainable and Inclusive Growth, Whitley Blackwell in July 2016, and is currently promoting her new book, The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, in the Spanish version, El Valor de las Cosas, Quién Produce y Quién Gana en la Economía Global. She scrutinized the way in which economic value has been accounted and reveals how economic theory has failed to clearly delineate the difference between value creation and value extraction. She argues that the increasingly blurry distinction between the 2 categories has allowed certain actors in the economy to portray themselves as value creators, while in reality they are just moving around existing value, or even worse, destroying it. As we can all see, she proposes an interesting and novel contribution. Sin más dilación, demos paso a la parte central del acto, que es la intervención de la profesora Mariana Mazzucato, finalizada la misma, moderando el profesor Ricardo Aguado, director del Departamento de Economía de Deusto Business School. Se le podrán trasladar algunas preguntas a viva voz, que habrá personas que podrán pasar el micrófono para que cada uno podamos expresarnos. Profesora Mazzucato tiene la palabra. Professor Mazzucato, the floor is yours.
Hola, qué honor. Bueno, ¿puedo hablar español o inglés? Mejor inglés, ¿verdad? Pero gracias, muchísimas gracias. Es un verdadero honor estar aquí también porque llegué ayer y tuve 2 horas por visitar el museo, que es una inspiración también por lo que voy a decir, porque es un fruto también de invertimiento público y también como ownership. And what I'd like to do is both to talk about the book, but also really to talk about, I'm not sure why we're here already. Has it moved? Oops, maybe I'll wait for someone to come from the IT. What's happening here? How important it is actually to talk about the experiences of different places in the world and how they are growing, and the quality of the relationships, the quality of the governance structures. And of course, here in the Basque Country, you have such a rich experience. We were just talking about it with Governor Unai. And the degree to which it's actually understood, reflected on, and used as a learning experience also across Europe, what works, what doesn't, in terms of corporate governance, but also in terms of the relationships between the public sector, the private sector, trade unions, civil society organizations, which are increasingly important in areas like energy and health. It's just not the way we're talking about Europe. right? So there's conditions being attached, for example, for the bailout schemes, which just have to do with numbers, you know, the size of your deficit, too large, too small. Well, it's never too small, they say. And so as opposed to these issues about the conditions that we know work, imagine in Germany how important it's been for them to have a particular type of governance structure in terms of stakeholder value, workers on the boards of companies, how important it's been that they had the Fraunhofer Institutes creating these very dynamic linkages between science and industry, how important it is that they actually spend serious money, not tokenistic money, on vocational training for workers who really then can hopefully adapt when we have big transitions, for example, to a green economy. None of that is used as a condition for the money that we use, whether it's bailing out a country like Greece, whether it's rethinking you know, what we need right now in Europe in terms of structures within the governments. We, in Italy, had a riforma della pubblica amministrazione, very similar, surely, to how you say it in Spanish, and it was just cut. It was not about these much more interesting granular conditions. So can I just say, you know, a huge thank you for inviting me here to the museum in the first instance, to Juan Ignacio Vidarte, of course to the governor, Unai, and of course to the head of the business school, Alvaro. It's a huge honor, so thank you, and I want to learn from you as much as I'm here to talk. And I will put on my timer so I don't talk too much. Okay, so unfortunately I've written this book, so now I actually have to talk about it. Otherwise, I would have loved to also talk about these bigger issues that are burning in Europe. As Greta says, the house is on fire, not just for the climate, but also for what kind of Europe do we want. So I will talk about the book because that's why I was invited, and I do think it's important, otherwise I would have wasted 4 years of writing it. But I really want to use it again to come back to these issues I just raised. What kind of growth? How do we talk not just about the rate, but the direction? What does it mean for the public, private, third sector relationships? And what's funny is that, you know, these covers look very serious, right? But the first cover that was proposed to me by the American publisher, actually the English publisher, was this one here. And I said, no, that doesn't look serious. That, you know, that looks like the Roadrunner show. I don't know if you have seen the Roadrunner show when you were young. But then as I was writing it, I regretted it, actually, because the Roadrunner, you know, has that famous thing where he's sawing the branch, and then the whole thing falls down. And in some ways, that was quite emblematic of what then was inside the book. But they say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, so let's move on. But I also opened the book with this very interesting phrase that was said by one of the first trade unionists in the US, Big Bill Haywood. If you replace the word gold by the word financial sector, it's quite interesting because it seems that every time there's a financial crisis, this question keeps coming up, which is, what have we done? How could it be that all these funds end up back inside the financial sector when actually value is created collectively? Of course, also by finance, assuming that we structure the financial institutions properly. But it's a wonderful quote, so let me just read it. He says, the barbarous gold barons, again, just put Goldman Sachs instead of gold, no, just kidding. Anyway, gold barons, they did not find the gold, they did not mine the gold, they did not mill the gold, but by some weird alchemy, magic, it all belongs to them. And again, you know, this wasn't the first or the last financial crisis we just had, but if you look in the history of financial crises, and we've tended to have them recurringly in the history of capitalism, even before capitalism, actually, what's interesting is that this question just keeps coming up, and yet the answers we give to the question, which is a very smart question, have been far too superficial. And in fact, it was interesting that after the crisis, on both sides of the political spectrum, and also on the sides of the economy, whether it was politics or business, you had this kind of deep questioning. And so there was Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, a big investment fund, who wrote this famous letter to the 500 CEOs saying, we've lost our way. We've lost our way. You know, change. We have to change. We're too speculative, too short-termist, the usual thing. We're obsessing too much about quarterly returns, et cetera. But not much has happened. Similar questions, by the way, have been posed by some industrialists like Paul Polman, the head of Unilever, who's stepping down. We actually ran a very nice workshop together in Davos about this issue. I was kind of arguing it from the public side, saying even the public has lost its purpose. And he was saying the private has lost its purpose. And we're like, oh my God, everyone's lost their purpose. And so we had this very nice workshop up in the mountains above Davos. But again, what can we do to really have structural change and not just allow this to become a blah, blah talking shop? But what was interesting was Ed Miliband, when he was trying to run for election, he brought this up as part of his platform. And he was actually told to stop by the Labour Party. They said, this is too, how do you say, tense. It's too much of a tense issue. We're going to lose the election if you talk that way. Because he was literally saying, we have the wrong type of capitalism. Tenemos un capitalismo parasitario, predatory. We need a more functional, productive form of capitalism, not a parasitic capitalism. They said, no, stop. That sounds bad for business. It's not bad for business. It's not bad for business. It's not bad for all the actors in the economy to question there's different ways to do this stuff. There's different forms of capitalism. And again, in the Basque region, you are a living experiment with companies like Mondragon that there's different ways to do capitalism. Let's talk about it. Let's come out of the closet and talk about it, literally, because it's simply not out there as a dynamic discussion. By the way, when he lost the election, okay, in 2015, day 2, I still remember because I was actually quite disgusted by this, and it was partly why I decided really to write this book. I was already writing it, but it became even more urgent for me. The Labour Party heads, including Tony Blair, who, you know, was not anymore a head, but he was still writing, said we lost because we didn't embrace the wealth creators. And who did he mean by wealth creators? Business. The ex-head of a Labour Party, I mean, it just says labor, trabajo, not Labour Party, uses the word wealth creators just for a small part of the economy, business. Of course, business creates wealth, but so do workers, so do different types of public institutions. That, to me, explained why they lost the election, not the fact that this poor guy actually had tried to bring this interesting discussion to the fore. And so in the book, what I do is kind of unpick this stuff. You know, how do we talk about wealth creation? How do we talk about value creation? Why has it become so superficial? And what can we do to make it become, again, at the heart of how we talk about the economy, but also literally in Europe, because we are in Europe. I know I just came from London, but we can talk about that maybe, hopefully not, because I'll get depressed, you know, about the kind of Europe, the kind of competitiveness that we want to reach, and what does it actually mean for value. And what I argue in the book is that because the discussion has become so superficial, and in some ways, forgive me, Alvaro, for saying this, but because it's left the economics departments, the debate about value, and only gone to the business schools, as great as business schools can be, not all, Deusto Business School is, it's become a bit fuzzy. It becomes very easy to talk about shareholder, value, shared, value, value chains, but what the hell is value? What are we actually talking about? And what's interesting is it used to be at the heart of economic analysis. Literally, the textbooks had the theory of value, and there's a real debate between economists. And so what I argue in the book is that because it's become quite a flaky, fuzzy, simply business schooly, okay, I'll stop now, discussion, it's become much easier for value extraction to be done in the name of value creation. So I would never argue that value extraction is anything new. In fact, I will show you in a minute how much in the 1700s it was at the heart of a lot of thinking. But what's new in the knowledge economy, in the modern digital economy, is that value extraction is done in the name of value creation. That's new. And that's what we must battle and try to understand exactly what's happening. So the landlords in the 1700s didn't pretend to be value creators. They just said, give me your money. That's why Adam Smith called rent robbery. And so we should be careful, because as Plato said, storytellers rule the world. Well, what are the stories? What are the actual stories and discourses and narratives being used to talk about value and wealth creation? And let's, again, bring them really to the fore so that it's harder to masquerade this value extraction in the name of value creation. And these stories are everywhere. They really are everywhere. I was shocked that just 1 year after the crisis, Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, with a completely straight face, this wasn't his attempt at making an after-dinner joke or anything, he said, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. Right? And it's interesting, as we'll see in a minute, it becomes sort of a tautology. If the way we are measuring value is by price, and hence also incomes, which in some ways are the price of work in particular sectors, then it's no coincidence that those who are earning the most can very confidently also call themselves the most productive. But what do we actually mean by that? Can a teacher, can a civil servant be as proud and confident and also have the accounting measures to make this claim of being the most productive in the world? And it's interesting, of course, in Silicon Valley, and this was mainly really the heart of my previous book, El Estado Emprendedor, just how confident the different actors are about calling themselves wealth creators. And we shouldn't say they're not. This is absolutely not the point of the book, to say bad or good. Of course, there's huge amounts of wealth creation inside different types of businesses, and in that particular part of the world, there was a lot of great, interesting things done. But when we don't have the vocabulary, the stories, the discourse, the narratives to talk about this much more collective creation of value, as I was saying, you in the Basque Country are living exemplars of in terms of how you govern your economy with public, private, but also inside companies. Some of your famous companies like Mondragon being cooperatives, then we have a problem. We have a problem of the discourse. And I'll go through different examples later, but I find one of the most striking examples of the way that this story about value is done is in the pharmaceutical industry, which is a sector which around the world receives huge amounts of public money. Just in the US, the National Institutes of Health spend over 30 billion, 9 zeros, dollars on this sector, and then somehow the prices of the goods that are produced from that collective effort are simply set by the pharmaceutical industry in the name of value. Literally, value-based pricing is the formula that's used, which basically just means allow the price to go to whatever the market will bear. Anyway, so this attempt to bring back this concept of value, for me, is really not about saying there's a good or bad theory of value, but let's bring it back to how we debate, and let's make it contested. Contested meaning something that we can actually argue over. Even something like the public spaces that are created and the value that we try to create in a public square or a part of the city, well, we need to make sure that we're asking whose value are we actually talking about, whose experience. And I just mentioned this because we just ran a very nice series which was trying to bring back this discourse about value and public purpose at the heart of the city itself. So this happened in London at the British Library, and it was very interesting to speak to designers, urban planners, and architects on how they understand public value. So just because you enter a square that's free to enter, are you actually in the public? And what is the value that's being created by making it much safer for some people than for others to feel confident and safe in a public space? Anyway, let me move on. So as I said, what was interesting is really in the history of economic thought, this idea of who makes, who takes, and how can we actually make sure that the economy is producing enough to create enough value, which can also be redistributed, but especially is not siphoned out either by the landlords or the kings and the queens, too much value going out of the system, has actually been a constant, a continuous sort of form of discussion. And it's not surprising that the way that value has been talked about has been related to what was happening in the particular periods, except in some ways in the modern period, where we've sort of come up with this semi-odd thinking that somehow value is just about preferences. So workers' wages are about their preferences for leisure versus work and issues around that. But again, I'll come back to it later. But in the 1600s, where there was lots of international trade, Spain, of course, being one of the great trading nations of the time, it's not surprising that it was the terms of trade, exchange, there was the 1651 Navigation Acts, that trade was at the center of how people thought about value. So really, again, those terms of trade, to the point that I would almost argue that Trump today, who's spending so much time arguing that the US needs to become great again simply by getting the terms of trade right and really focusing so much on the relationships, whether it's NAFTA or China, in some ways has resurrected this mercantilist view of value. So he's brought us back 400 years. He's done a lot of other things, but that's one of them. And the physiocrats, of course, writing in the 1700s when it was still an agricultural economy. It's, again, not surprising that they put at the center of their understanding of where value came from farm labor, to the point that they actually made what I call one of the first Excel sheets ever, the tableau économique of François Quesnay, which is really interesting, especially if you look at the names on the top. So they thought that farmers, again, were basically the real producers of value, but then that obviously had to circulate in the economy. So you had the mercantilists and others who had to, if you want, create that exchange, who he called the proprietors. But then what's very interesting is they came up with this name of the sterile class, literally sterility in the sense of potentially putting reproductiveness, think of it in terms of, again, sexual reproduction, at risk, and those were the landlords. So if too much money was being siphoned out of the system in the way that Big Bill Haywood described in terms of how the gold owners were doing, siphoning it out of the system, not redistributing it also to those who were milling and mining the gold, that would put the system itself at risk. And what's very interesting here is, again, they were trying to understand how farm labor produced value, how it was distributed, and the dangers of siphoning out too much value. And classical economists, the famous ones, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, writing in the times of the Industrial Revolution, again, not surprising that they put so much emphasis on labor and the division of labor. Remember Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where he had that great example of the pin factory and how important it was to understand how interesting ways to increase and make more dynamic the division of labor in a factory would increase productivity, would increase growth, and hence increase the wealth of nations. And they had a whole debate, which was kind of coined the labor theory of value, but it kind of hides a lot of disagreement, actually, between Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. But, underlying it was this notion that they wanted to better understand the objective conditions of production, who was doing what, how were they organized, and how would, for example, mechanization, which was really happening a lot in that period, what effect would it have on wages and employment? But this quote here I love because it's quite, I don't know, I think Adam Smith must have gone to the opera or something the night before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, because in this description of who was productive and who was not, he kind of labored to the extent that musicians and opera singers and opera dancers and all these buffoons in the opera houses are not productive. Now, what he was actually trying to do here was not to create a blame game, you're good, you're bad, but really to make sure that we understood, actually, there's some professions, including most of the people in this room, right? So who are we here? We're men of letters, men and women of letters of all kinds, many of these people here. Lawyers, churchmen, doctors, and all these others. They might have an important role in the economy, but that had a different, you needed sort of a different analysis to understand what that role was in terms of perhaps creating important cultural areas, or as you know, he also was very interested in morality, so he wasn't as deterministic as it could seem in terms of having productive and unproductive labor, but this real emphasis of also looking at where did the heart of economic growth come from and how it could also be distributed in good ways from, to culture, but also in problematic ways if too much was siphoned out, was very much also in the classicals a core of their thinking. And they also had this very interesting concept of rent. rent, which has come up again in recent writings, people like Stiglitz, who look at inequality, as well as Piketty. But rent in the classicals was different from how we talk about rent today. Rent seeking or rent in neoclassical economics is really this idea that you have an imperfection, some sort of asymmetry, a problem that doesn't get us a competitive price. And it, in theory, can be competed away. You can compete monopoly power away. What was interesting in the classicals is their idea of rent was more grounded in, again, an objective analysis of who's doing what, and could it actually be that in some professions you actually have unearned income, literally things just moving around, not much actually being created, and yet fees being charged, for example, and so value being extracted out without anything being created. And it's interesting, again, Adam Smith was very fierce on rent, to the point that probably one of the biggest misunderstandings in modern economic thought happened, because the free market, the concept of the free market in Adam Smith was not free from the state. It was free from rent. Interesting, huh? I always tell this when I go on Newsnight, this program in the US, sorry, in the UK at 10:30. I'm usually a bit asleep, and then I wake up because they always put me against some very conservative people, always from the Adam Smith Institute. And they too maybe are a bit sleepy at that hour, so I kind of strike them when I say, and by the way, do you know what the free market was, what Adam Smith meant? Because they are in this institute called the Adam Smith Institute, and they always say, yeah, free from the state. I'm like, no, page X in the Wealth of Nations. Anyway, and so the implications from the classicals was, again, that it was very much their understanding of value was tied to their understanding of production and how production was governed, how the value that was created was shared, the division of labor, mechanization, et cetera. And reproduction, like in the physiocrats, was very much the focus. So if you did have too much rent seeking, you would have a problem for the economy. By the way, one thing that was very important in the classicals that I already mentioned was this issue of mechanization. So it was just mentioned before in the introduction, how we have to understand the role of technology. And it's interesting today, if you think about it, just how much discussion there is on the robots, the future of work, because of this increasing mechanization, which we're seeing in terms of AI, big data, and sometimes just encapsulated as the robots. What's interesting, if you look at the classicals, precisely because they were so focused on the relationships between value, prices, income, and the objective conditions of production, it's also machinery, they were already asking this question we're all asking today, back then. So David Ricardo, in 1821, when he wrote Principles of Political Economy, which was one of the first textbooks ever, really, of economic theory. Before that, economists were kind of philosophers at the same time. This was like the first proper economics book. He had a chapter called On Machinery, where he was already very worried about this issue of mechanization on the effect of unemployment and wages. But what happened then for basically 200 years was that those profits being earned in the economy through this mechanization, because it did produce growth, it did produce more wealth for the nations, was redistributed back into the economy. Sorry, it was reinvested back into the economy. And as I'll show in a moment, one of the big crises that we have today is that these profits are not being reinvested back in. So it's not really a robots problem. It's a corporate governance problem. It's a reinvestment of profits problem. But I just raised that here because this focus in the classicals on these objective conditions was absolutely tied to the attention that they were paying to this issue of mechanization, work, and employment, which is such a big issue today in all the papers. And later what happened, and I'm sort of skipping very quickly here, in neoclassical economics, by putting so much emphasis on prices, on equilibrium, on marginal decision-making, so marginal utility, everyone is maximizing their individual maximization function. So companies are maximizing profits. Workers are maximizing their decisions of leisure versus work. Consumers are maximizing their utility functions. It's basically, we get to the point where value itself goes from being tied to the objective conditions of production, whether it was agricultural or industrial labor, and again, the division of labor, technology, production, and all its dynamic attributes, to a much more subjective form of analysis. And forget whether this is good or bad. It's just a huge revolution, which most economic students don't even realize because they're not taught the history of economic thought. So basically what neoclassical economics does is it brings a subjective notion of value. And also what's interesting is that by not then really looking at the objective conditions as much in terms of the central way they thought about value, things like the class struggle basically disappear because wages themselves, as I said, become just a function of these preferences. And also the logic, instead of it going from a deep theory of value, again tied to all these objective conditions, which turns into a theory of price, right, as they had, the reverse logic occurs. You have a theory of price, supply and demand curves, et cetera, which then turns into a theory of value. And so, in fact, we only include, for example, in GDP and how we measure output, those things that have a price. We make no actual value judgment on whether this is actually increasing or decreasing. And so what the book argues is precisely that unfortunately two things happen. One is that we kind of overemphasize this subjective nature, which made it very hard to differentiate profits, for example, from rents. Again, rents as unearned income, but also that the logic goes from theory of price to theory of value, so it just becomes much fuzzier. What is value? What actually is it? So this distinction that I was raising in the beginning, which was so central, kind of starts becoming fuzzy, and it makes it much easier for these particular actors to have this very confident self-proclamation, I'm a value creator, I create wealth, to the point that even, as I mentioned, the Labour Party itself gets confused. And so what I do, and I'm going to do this quite quickly now, is I run through the book chapter by chapter and what the implications are. What are the implications of this confusion and this lack of contestability, debate, interesting debate in society about what is value, to how we measure wealth, how we govern companies, how we think about prices for really important things like drugs, medicines that we need in order to survive, how we think about really interesting new developments in capitalism like digital platform capitalism, the Facebooks and the Googles, what to do with them, how to regulate, issues around privacy, that gets affected as well, and also how we think of the role of government. And given the previous book that I wrote, which was so much about actually we need to better understand what government can do, for me, obviously, this is very important. So I will run through this quite quickly. It's literally just 4 implications. I have a couple slides for each. I will just state it. I won't really go into the deep thinking behind it, but this is just to let you know this stuff matters. This isn't just an intellectual debate. Oh, value went from being objective to subjective. Oh, we changed the logic from value to price to value. This isn't just a history of economic thought exercise. Having said that, given how many economists and business school students are in the room, it is important for you and for schools and curriculums and the teaching of economics to make sure that we really go through this history of economic thought and realize there's different ways to think about value. Because in fact, the reason the value word isn't even used anymore is it's just assumed. Basically, Econ 101 is a particular theory of value, but by not even saying the word, it hides the fact that there's different ways to think about this. So first, and this is kind of the obvious one, how we measure GDP is super influenced by this debate, or lack of debate. Basically, if there's a price, we include it. So this is why, for years, feminists have argued, hey, there's all these other things that are really valuable that we do in the home, like care, and just because it doesn't have a price, that's wrong. And so there's been lots of thinking about that. Similarly, with environmentalists, lots of bad things we do, like pollution, and somehow we don't include that. GDP doesn't go down. So if you pollute, GDP goes up. If you marry your cleaner, GDP goes down. I often say that just to wake people up so they start using their brains. But also what's even more not more interesting, what's also interesting but less attended to is what has happened in the financial sector. So most of finance wasn't even included in GDP up until 1970 or so. It was literally seen, even though not necessarily framed that way, as rent. Or at the time, as just a transfer of existing wealth from one part of the economy to another, in the same way that Social Security payments would be a transfer of money around the system. You wouldn't include that in GDP. And so what started to happen when the size of the sector started to grow, this data here is for the UK economy, and you can see the growth of financial intermediation, so think of the whole widely defined and not just banking, financial sector, when it started to grow and really outpace in many ways the rest of the economy, you had the people who were doing the national accounting also inside the United Nations. There was a group called the SNA, those doing the systems of national accounts, thinking, oh my God, there's this blob that basically we're not taking into account. We need to rethink this. And in particular, net interest payments, the difference between what banks were earning when they give out a loan and paying out for deposits, that was not being included. So just if you were paying a mortgage provider a fee, that would be included because it was classic, it had a price, we include it, but those net interest payments were seen as just these transfers. And so they gave it a name. They said that investment banks were risk-taking, that was the service that literally went into the national income and product accounting, and commercial banks, financial intermediation. And what's interesting there is literally that, no judgment was made of, oh, wait, why is this sector growing so much? What is it actually doing? Going back to the question of the physiocrats, is it actually siphoning value out of the system, or is it really contributing? And of course, the answer to that would be granular. There's plenty of different types of financial institutions or instruments that maybe are really important for the economy. But in fact, what we've seen in the recent data, and again, I really recommend, if you're interested in this, to read the work of Andy Haldane, is that the problem with this figure, or the problem underlying it, is that what actually was happening, and this is global, is that finance was financing finance. So other parts of the financial sector. Hyman Minsky was already talking about this at the time, so was John Maynard Keynes. So finance, insurance, and real estate, FIRE, has absorbed huge amounts of the financial sector's funds. In the UK, 90%. So only 10% of the finance in the UK goes back into the real economy. Talk about siphoning value out. And as long as that would find its way back in, we wouldn't have a problem. But there's very little evidence that that's been happening, and that's precisely why this area has been growing so much compared to the rest of the economy. And that also shows up in terms of financial corporate profits as a share of domestic profits. Second, how we govern institutions, right? So again, we know there's varieties of way to do this, and as I mentioned, I keep mentioning because I think it's such an important, untold international story, the history of Mondragon, which is a cooperative. It's run much more around principles of stakeholder governance, as I was mentioning earlier in the beginning. Germany also, even without the cooperatives, they also have the stakeholder governance where you have workers and their trade union representatives on the governance, on the governing boards of corporations. But most international, multinational corporations are run through this concept of maximization of shareholder value. And what's interesting is that while it's been attacked by many on both sides of the political spectrum, of the economic spectrum, not really much has been done to be a thorn in its side. And that, I really think, is because, again, the underlying concept of value within that hasn't been unpicked. So people have looked at the consequences, too much short-termism, too much speculation, not enough long-run thinking, like that letter by Larry Fink that I mentioned in the beginning to the 500 CEOs, where he basically said that. But that's not enough. That's going to appeal to people's kind of just intuition and kind of thinking, okay, this is bad because we don't get long-term growth. But unless you unpick the underlying assumptions of value in this framework, you don't have a change. And so what's interesting is if you look at one of the practices that has increased when we obsess about maximizing shareholder value, it's very much this kind of idea that you should just focus on the share price itself. So for example, buying back your shares, which is growing exponentially around the world as a practice, buying back your shares to boost stock options, surprise, surprise, executive pay, is if you want, justified through this idea. But if you look at, again, and sorry, this data here shows you that huge amounts are being spent on share buybacks. This summary figure here is actually much higher now. If you look at the last 10 years, so 2008 to 2018, 3 trillion, so 12 zeros, have been used by global Fortune 500 companies just to buy back their shares. And again, assuming that that somehow would lead to those profits being reinvested back in, no problem, but very little evidence for that. The underlying idea behind maximization of shareholder value is that shareholders are the biggest risk takers. So Michael Jensen, writing back at Harvard Business School in the 1980s, said that shareholders were the residual claimants. In other words, those who were, if you want, taking the most risk. They had no guaranteed rate of return, so only everyone else, like the banks, would get their interest, the workers would get their salary, and the shareholders were risking to get nothing. So in fact, when there was a big booty, big return at the end of, say, the biotech boom, the dot-com boom, they somehow had the right to get this massive amount of wealth because they, in fact, took the biggest risks. So this idea of the residual, what's left over. And if you unpick that, it's quite extraordinary, the falsity on top of which it's based, because it's simply not true that shareholders are the only ones without a guaranteed rate of return. In the book, The Entrepreneurial State, I show the massive amount of risk-taking with no guaranteed rate of return that the state has played, for example, in all the technology in your smartphones, whether it's the internet, GPS. For each of those successes, there was many failures. That's risk-taking. Workers take risks all the time when they enter a workforce in a particular company and maybe are willing to take on lower wages, lower salaries in the beginning, thinking they have a lifelong career. There's no guarantee of that, right? So there's different ways to think about risk-taking, and the fact that this particular practice of maximizing shareholder value is underpinned by the assumption that shareholders are the biggest risk-takers, that's what we need to be debating, not, oh, this is just going to lead to a lot of short-termism. But it does lead to a lot of short-termism. In fact, what we see is that the amount of global investment has fallen. Sorry, here we go. That's it here. The business investment as a percentage of GDP is falling in terms of the funds being reinvested back in, but also the percentage of cash flows returning to shareholders has increased because of the effect I mentioned. And the profit-labor ratio, the profit-wage share of GDP globally is at record levels. So we have low investment, but not low profits. And by the way, the reason many government policies don't work is they're just affecting profits, not investment. So most tax credits, even R&D tax credits, actually have an influence mainly on profits. And unless you design them really, really well, they actually don't lead to those profits being reinvested. They just lead to more time golfing or doing other fun things. I already mentioned the kind of scandal behind pharmaceutical pricing. And by scandal, I mean, of course, pharmaceutical companies are contributing to the production process, but the degree to which this is exaggerated, so it's only their maximization of shareholder value, but also literally through a formula that's called value-based pricing, this really is the best emblematic, if you want, symbol of this problem of confusing value and prices. So when the price of Nostrum Pharmaceuticals, an antibiotic, that the company was making, went up recently, 2 months ago, by 400%, so the price of an antibiotic overnight went up by 400%, the CEO said he had a moral imperative. He actually used those words. We have a moral imperative to let prices go to what the economy, the market will bear. And again, this is what leads to Goldman Sachs. I love quoting Goldman Sachs. They come up with the best things, saying that actually maybe curing patients is a bad business model if what in the end you need are these very high prices to earn the profits. If everyone's cured and you no longer need those drugs, the companies won't be very needed. This is also the reason why the ex-chief economist of Goldman Sachs recently, what's his name, McNeil? His last name is escaping me, sorry. Just 2 weeks ago, he said that the pharmaceutical companies making antibodies and antibiotics, if they're not willing to play the game, in other words, actually produce the drugs that the world needs, maybe they should just become nationalized. And this kind of, woke everyone up when an ex-Goldman Sachs economist starts threatening the pharmaceutical companies with nationalizing them, something's gone wrong. But what's also really interesting is the whole debate around Google and Facebook and, Vestager, who's just fined Google for 1.5 billion or whatever it was, again, just 2 weeks ago. It's a really interesting debate, but it's a very skewed, narrow debate because of how it's being framed. The underlying concept that it's just these digital companies creating the value, and then you need the regulators like Vestager, as smart as she is, to go regulate the process, kind of doesn't upset the status quo. It's not a thorn in the side of the value proposition behind it. It's always just reactive. We have to worry later about privacy, later about taxation. And what's interesting in Spain, again, I keep mentioning Spain as the forefront of everything here, but it's sort of true in this case also. In Barcelona, you have the mayor, Ada Colau, actually upsetting this system. She says, hold on a second. why do they even have the data in the first place? So you don't just react to them having the data with taxation and privacy, you start rethinking the relationships, the institutional, organizational relationships, and she has set up a project called, I think it's called Decidim, and another one called Decode, where she's bringing in hackers into city government to think about how the data that's generated when you click on Citymapper comes back to the city itself in order to improve public value. So the value, for example, of transport, public transport. And there's bigger questions that we should be raising in the same ways that we govern human rights and other things through advisory bodies, international bodies that govern something as important as human rights. If it's true that data is the new oil, and the data is literally your worth, everything about you, every time you're clicking on what you prefer, what you want to buy, and your children are doing the same thing, this kind of goes to very much who you are. We need to rethink where that data is going in the first place, and rethinking that in terms of maybe having a public repository, not public meaning owned or governed by one big bureaucrat, but by an interesting group of different stakeholders, which then companies would have to either pay or sign up to certain conditions to access that data. That would be a fundamentally different value proposition. But this ability of the Silicon Valley companies in particular, not only to call themselves the wealth creators, the value creators, doesn't help in rethinking these institutions. As soon as you start seeing that the technology to retrieve the data was publicly financed, just internet for Google, GPS for Uber, et cetera, and the data is of the citizens, how come we haven't thought this through and just allowed that data to go inside these companies? And lastly, government. Lloyd Blankfein again saying, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. Do we have the same level of confidence inside the civil service? We bureaucrats are the wealth creators of the world. We are the most productive in the world. No, because in fact, we only include, literally in GDP, the costs of the state. So the salaries of teachers, as low as they might be, go into GDP. That's the cost. But we haven't figured out how to value, for example, a properly funded, properly structured public education system or public health system. So the actual output is not included. So government is only really seen in the economy as a spender, not a producer, except if you actually have state-owned companies. And even there, it's interesting how they're included. Anyway, as a regulator, as an administrator, as a fixer of different types of market failures. And so this becomes really difficult when you actually have, in modern-day capitalism, really big challenges, whether it's about climate change, future of mobility, all sorts of clean growth, and thinking about the demographic challenges that would require public, private, third sector thinking, investment, co-creation of value, of spaces, of confronting these challenges together. If we have a system of not being able to really value the state actors, then we also have a crisis of confidence, a crisis in the accounting system itself, but also that affects the kinds of partnerships that we end up building. And by the way, the curriculum that's taught to public servants, which comes from public choice theory and new public management, which has coincided with, I think personally, a pretty neoliberal view of how the economy is structured, is not a coincidence that in the end, it basically has convinced people that government failure is even worse than market failure. So you should occupy as little space as possible, otherwise you will be crowding out business, completely ignoring the fact that actually it's when you've had ambitious kind of public investments in areas like the BBC in the UK, it was very ambitious. It actually, by being ambitious and creating public value and investing in the process, not just regulating and spending, they ended up creating new spaces which crowded in business, created exciting new areas where business then could follow. And so in the Estado Emprendedor, I kind of told that bit of the story, but what I did in this new book on value is literally kind of unpick the accounting problem in terms of this inability of us even to account for that publicly created value. And the reason I set up this Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL was really to bring back this debate about how do we really change these narratives in that Plato kind of way, storytellers rule the world. Where are the new stories that we can be telling of how public, private, third sector can come together to really meet the big challenges we have ahead? And surprise, surprise, the word public value doesn't exist in economics department. governments. And so part of this changing the narrative is also, again, this much more activist, kind of proactive agenda of also what policy is for, not fixing markets, but co-creating, not de-risking, but welcoming uncertainty. What are the capabilities and capacities you need in state structures in your region in order to co-create and co-shape value, not just fix? That needs to be translated into the curriculum, and that's why we've just set up a master's in public administration, which transforms all these crossings out into this more active agenda. And literally the question is, what is the curriculum? What is also the political economic framework that this requires? And I think in terms of what to do, and this is sort of the last chapter of the book, which some say should have been the whole book, but the book for me was very much about unpicking the problems with how economic theory has evolved, so I didn't spend perhaps enough time on this bit, but this is sort of what I'm now doing through the Institute. This is all we talk about and do, both in terms of the training, but also the doing out there in policymaking, is we try to bring value, again, as a collective category back to the center. Markets have to be co-shaped, co-created. That needs its own framework. So market failure theory is not going to get us a green transition. The question is, what is an alternative framework? But also this whole notion of stakeholder governance, which again you have in companies like Mondragon. What does it actually mean to systematize that for kind of global learning? What does it actually mean for how we build more symbiotic public-private partnerships? So the word ecosystem doesn't just become this, a flaky word that everyone uses it as though it's a good thing. How do we build symbiotic, mutualistic ecosystems in the economy? I was just being told by Governor Unai that, for example, this museum not only was publicly invested in, as often most cultural institutions are, but it's also owned partly by the public sector. And so the returns come back and you can fuel new cultural investments with that. That again means doing more than just taxation. It means becoming an active player in the economy. And how can we, using the terms that I mentioned come from classical political economy, steer activities back into the production boundary? Instead of just doing a blame game and saying, oh, the hedge fund's bad, oh, the credit default swap's bad. How can we reform finance? Let's put it into the production boundary. Otherwise, you get really stupid industrial policies that say finance is bad, industry is good, forgetting how financialized industry has become. So industry itself needs to be changing its practices to go back into the production boundary and being part of the solution, not part of the problem. Definancializing it, delinking drug prices from perceived value, but also in order for the prices to be a reflection of that collective value creation. And in a world where there's so many challenges, like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, which have been signed up to by over 100 countries, this is the moment to say, all right, let's change. We've signed up to those SDGs. What would be the roadmap to get there in terms of also rethinking these value concepts? And just lastly, I'll spend 2 minutes on this. What I've been doing recently in Europe, and I'd love to talk to your government more about this, how you're seeing your own role with this kind of change, is for a long time in Europe, we've talked about challenges, right? There's challenges, and so if you went to the European Commission, up until recently, it always said smart, inclusive, and sustainable growth, right? These were big challenges for Europe. They wanted to be more inclusive, more sustainable, and more innovation-led. And not much changed, as I mentioned. Then when we have when things get difficult, we just tell the countries to cut their spending instead of rethinking really what they need to become more innovation-led, inclusive, and sustainable. So what I argued with the European Commission was that they really needed a different framework, and I called it the missions framework, which now has been voted on by the European Council and the Parliament. So it's actually part of the legal framework of the Horizon program, which is 100 billion in innovation funding. And I did this through my advisory role for Carlos Moedas, who's a Portuguese man who's currently the commissioner for innovation. And the idea was, let's be bold. Let's really bring the public, the private, the third sector together in concrete, measurable ways with conditionality to use European funds to tackle the big challenges that European citizens have in their daily lives, like polluted cities, like a demographic issue where the aging populations are having a harder time in terms of not necessarily having the solutions they need. And the idea was to be inspired by the moonshot. When we went to the moon and back again, as humans did back in the 60s, that required investment in innovation across many parts of the economy. You needed the state to come up with this kind of big, interesting, bold idea, but the investments came from many different places, including nutrition. You couldn't just eat a hamburger up there, including clothing and textiles. You couldn't just wear jeans and a t-shirt, and of course aeronautics. And then what was interesting was they literally transformed everything that government had at its disposal, like procurement policy, prizes, and grants, to crowd in all the different multiple solutions on how to get there. And what's really interesting is I saw yesterday in the museum the exhibit by Richard Serra, who talks about this in his own way. And at first, he actually says the opposite. He said, don't worry about the goal, just worry about the process. And in the process itself, as it unfolds. Don't just give out money to sectors that ask for it. You need to be a mission-oriented bank, so you provide patient, long-term, committed finance, not short-term exit-driven finance, to solve the problems that Scotland has. And that's where you kind of pick the willing, not pick the winners, of those organizations in Scotland that are willing to engage with the difficult missions that you put forth. And the conditions of the lending should also be structured in such a way that you also perhaps make sure the companies that are getting access to those loans are also part of the solution, not part of the problem. And they have something called the Business Pledge in Scotland, which are 10 conditions like paying the living wage, reinvesting your profits, doing a green transition within your own value chain, which now we're working with them to make that a condition to get the loans. So you don't micromanage the companies in terms of what they do, but there should be some conditions attached to public funds. Unless the companies just want to act on their own, then fine, but don't access the public funds. And this is, again, where I think that whole stakeholder governance and the cooperative model becomes so interesting, and you really are, I think, the global experiment around this. And I just wish and hope, maybe we can talk about this also in the future, how your voice, your experience, it's not always rosy, surely there's problems, but can really become a voice in Europe for how to structure or governance of companies, but also those public-private relationships in more interesting ways. And this is just a list of different things I've been working with governments, thinking through this conditionality issue, conditions on reinvesting profits. That's actually where Bell Labs came from. So Bell Labs was a very, very innovative company in the US, private R&D lab inside AT&T, which came about in a time of US history where the government was, not just giving out monopoly power, it was conditional on companies then reinvesting their profits. So AT&T was asked to reinvest its profits in the real economy, innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms, in order to maintain its monopoly status. That's where Bell Labs, very innovative lab, came from. Similarly, patents, which are 20-year monopolies that the state gives companies for good reasons, to incentivize innovation sometimes. They should be structured in ways that are sure that we get a public return for that monopoly power. So if patents are too wide, too strong, so hard to license, and too upstream, that's not good, because that's not going to help fuel innovation later, even when the patent is up. That blocks innovation. It's what William Baumol called unproductive entrepreneurship. There's ways we could cap the prices of those medicines which are publicly financed. Why not? That requires a governance mode, which is very different from just fixing. There's different ways to think, as you were telling me, Unai, about a public innovation fund. If you get a return for your investment, how you plow that back into the economy. And that's where state investment banks are interesting, because they're not just handing out money, they do returns on equity. Equity is interesting because if it's upstream, like R&D, there's no reason the government should retain equity. You just hope that the spillovers flow to the economy. But when governments are giving companies downstream money, so guaranteed loans, it's not always clear why it should just be kind of free money. So in the case of the US government gave Solyndra, a solar company that went bust, $500 million in a guaranteed loan. A similar amount of money went to Tesla, of Elon Musk. No one knows the Tesla story. Everyone knows the Solyndra story because it was a failure, so they blamed government. And had the US government, first of all, told the story to the citizens that they had invested in both, but also retained some equity in the successful one in order to pay off the downside, Solyndra, which is normal. Any venture capitalist will tell you that's normal. Every success, you'll have some failures. That would have been a different narrative, a different story, a different discourse through which the public-private discussion would have had. And similarly, when Obama did Obamacare and was blamed by the Tea Party saying, you're meddling in our health care, instead of just giving the social democratic response, which was, but of course we should, there's 60 million people with no insurance, he should have said, meddling? What are you talking about? We co-created that system. We invested X billion, and of course we should have the right as an investor and also making sure that our investment actually produces public value. In other words, people are benefiting from these drugs that we are helping to co-produce, as well as the social democratic issue, which is always important, which is about redistribution. Anyway, so I will finish now. The last chapter of the book is called The Economics of Hope. And perhaps our Q&A can be focused on this issue of what does it actually mean to build an economy with this proactive agenda focused on the societal challenges, which are about hope. We have to solve them. As Greta says, the house is on fire. Let's address it, but in ways that really change the institutional, organizational relationships so we can talk about value as co-created. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mazzucato, for this bright presentation. Thank you very much also for your energy, your passion, explaining us all these concepts about, these ideas about value, about the need of a new narrative, and the hope for the future. So now we have some minutes for questions from the public. We can have a couple of questions that can be asked in English or in Spanish, as you like. Any question from the public? Yes, we have one.
Hello, Gorka Spiau, Aguirre Lehendakaria Center. Thank you, Professor Mazzucato. My question is, your colleague Charles Leadbeater was here recently, and he was talking about the Basque opportunity and responsibility to share the experience that we had and connect with these debates that you were mentioning. In your opinion, do we realize about the real value of the Basque experience, or are we just reading this uncritically from your experience? Thank you.
So thanks for asking that. That's exactly the point that I began with, so I'm really glad you asked it so we can also bring it here at the end of this presentation, which is, what are we doing in Europe? There's such rich experiences. Do we have a way to map them, to understand them, to create a systematic way of kind of learning what works, what doesn't, not just in terms of policies, like innovation, policy, industrial strategy, but governance? And I think that your story here, through the Mondragon experience, which is not small, by the way. This isn't a little experiment. This is a large industrial company. At best, across Europe, we have some areas like the COP in Italy, which is more about retail, also important. It has its own very important legacy. But Mondragon is a large international player producing things with a very different governance structure. And I think in a world where there's all this talk about partnership, everyone says, I mean, have you ever heard anyone say, no, we don't partner, we don't like ecosystems? Everyone talks about public-private partnerships, PPP. They talk about ecosystems, and as soon as they talk about innovation, you have an experience where within the governance structure, you have a very interesting partnership, and between, again, as Governor Unai was explaining to me, you have a very interesting way to think about a co-investment in making this region more culturally rich, more, again, investment-led rich. In the UK, we currently are growing just through consumption. So private debt to disposable income is back at record levels. That's what caused the crisis. It's not in the national debate at all. None of the Brexit people, whether for or against, are raising this as an alarm bell. We're back with the same level of private debt to disposable income before the bubble burst. It's not even being talked about. So investment-led growth, what kind of investment, what kind of direction, talking about directionality, not just the rate of growth, is key for all of this. And I think in Europe, we've missed the trick. And this is why it's really important not to just be against the Brexiteers. It's true. We have, Europe has had huge problems. Just look at how the Troika dealt with Greece, or that Goldman Sachs, when they talk about pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, as though they are somehow just the periphery because they spent too much, versus really looking at some fundamental problems within those systems, like in Italy, where we have had 20 years of zero growth of productivity, 20, before the euro, by the way, because of the lack of ambitious public-private investment, and the state was only giving out handouts, subsidies, and guarantees. It wasn't really a lead investor, as it actually had been in early and some post-war Italian history. So I think the more we can bring your experience to the fore, but not only your experience, to the European discussion of let's stop obsessing about the deficit. The deficit, by the way, in Italy and Spain, I can't remember, I haven't looked at the exact numbers, but in Italy it's almost always been lower than Germany's. Italy's deficit has never been the problem. It's debt to GDP that's the problem. And debt to GDP is very high because the denominator has not been growing, because also public investment has been very low in terms of strategic investment. Lots of subsidies, guarantees, and money just being thrown away. Anyway, the more we can bring your own experience as a region, as governance structures, to the fore of a new European debate, where we really kind of hang out our dirty laundry to have a discussion of what kind of Europe we want, the better. Otherwise, these just become little experiments on the side. Charlie Ledbetter can come here, I can come here and say, oh, how interesting, but it doesn't become the way we transform Europe.
Okay. Thank you very much. More questions, please? Yes, we have another question there.
You've been talking before about the challenges that we have in the European Union. Do you think that we can get those to pass those challenges?
You can say it in Spanish.
Mejor. Vale, ¿crees que conseguiríamos pasar esos objetivos teniendo un solo gobernador en toda la Unión Europea y no teniendo 27? Sería mucho más fácil ponerse de acuerdo, ¿no? O sea, conseguir que una persona llevase a cabo las medidas necesarias para superar esos tres objetivos, que tener 27 que se tengan que poner de acuerdo.
Right. So I actually think that's a strength of Europe. It's really nice if it's structured properly, though. You have 27 member states yeah, with very different experiences. So you have 27 different voices. Within those countries, you have different experiences. So Spain is not all like Basque, yeah? So again, even richer. The problem is, do we have a format through that rich, interesting, qualitative, granular experience gets used to kind of scale up and systematize different ways of working? Or do we have one voice, kind of one ideological voice, which I don't think we have. I'm just saying the two extremes are kind of lots of voices and a bit chaotic, and the other extreme, one voice. There's something in the middle, but that something in the middle needs a structure. And I think this is the opportunity. And I think Macron, who's now currently acting like the voice of Europe, I think he needs to be careful himself. It's not to say Europe is great, Europe, it will set up its own DARPAs. So they have this interesting JEDI, J-E-D-I initiative in France where they're saying we need to do the moonshots. Instead of just doing the positive story, we need to start looking, this is what I meant by hanging our dirty laundry out. We need to question, why have we failed? Have we really been listening, for example, to the social movements? If not, we get populism. Charlie Ledbetter, we brought him into my institute precisely in order to reflect on his work around social movements and having been important for some big technological changes, including birth control pill, would have never happened without the feminist movement. AIDS drugs would have never happened without ACT UP. There's also a great movie about it out, the history of ACT UP. So the degree to which we can restructure Europe so it has more empathy, and empathy, by the way, is a skill. You need to invest in any skill. Listening power, so the leaders are engaging in a non-tokenistic way with those who are asking for change, bringing those voices to help us formulate what I call mission-oriented challenges, but using all the voices throughout the 27 member states for that consultation. Unfortunately, most consultations are done in a tokenistic way. It's almost like a form you fill out, no one really cares, and it definitely doesn't engage normal citizens. And so my quick answer to your question is, I think it's a good thing we have 27 member states, but what we need are new governance structures. For example, the missions that we're working on in Europe, there's 5 that have been selected as mission areas. They're quite broad, within which they'll do some missions. The question is, do we need a leader? Do we need a leader for each kind of mission? Because people matter. And maybe they're there just for 5 years. Like, DARPA brought in experts to come in for 5 years, told to welcome uncertainty, take risks, don't worry. But there was people that brought in teams. Can this just occur through a bureaucracy? No. So those are the kind of questions I think we should have. But the fact we have a rich 27 member state organization, that should be a force for good. And it's a different type of capitalism that Europe can propose to the Chinese one and to the American one. But it needs to refine its self-confidence. That's where I think Macron is good. He's kind of bringing back self-confidence, but self-confidence is superficial if it's just based on confidence for the sake of confidence. We should really build a new Europe in terms of tackling these challenges, which, by the way, if done ambitiously, create competitiveness. One quick example, in one country, Denmark, today is the #1 provider of high-tech green services to China. China is spending 1.7 trillion on green. And little country, smaller than the greater London area, is servicing it for the high-tech services and having manufacturing ability in terms of Vestas, et cetera. And the real question is, how did they do that? What did it mean to create a service and manufacturing sector together through the Copenhagen Green City movement, which created all these startups which weren't just starting up. I was mentioning to Unai before, I said, call it scale up. Not scallops, that's the fish. Scale-up Bay, which is how can you create in Spain an ecosystem which really allows your startups to scale up and to become relevant in the world of providing the goods and services that are needed to address these challenges. Obsessing, and I'm not saying in Spain, in general, people obsess about startups and not what are we actually starting up for.
Okay, we have time for a last question. So
by a woman.
Good. Possible.
Vale, si puede
No,
detallar...
there was a woman there. Oh, well, I guess she'll go later.
Sí, si puede detallar un poco más lo que valora de la colaboración público-privada, en nuestro caso, el caso vasco, que ha ensalzado. Y una segunda cuestión que iría hilada a esto, el caso del marketing, ¿no? El gobierno, de cara a la ciudadanía, tiene que vender, ¿no? Que al final hay un riesgo en sus inversiones, que es una cartera de inversión, donde como en el caso de Tesla puede acertar y en esa otra inversión de 500 millones Estados Unidos se equivocó, pero parece que la gente se queda con lo negativo. Habría que vender, ¿no? De cara a la ciudadanía, habría que hacer una labor de marketing de cara al riesgo de que las inversiones fallen. Eso, el caso vasco y esto respecto al marketing.
Okay. Should we take two at a time? So we have the last question. But
We are just...
No, I'm sorry. I can't be here and not have one woman ask a question.
Okay,
Please.
okay.
She had her hand up. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe we can take
Yeah,
both
yeah.
at the
No,
same
no.
time.
Take both at the same time. Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, thank you. You were talking before about care in homes and about the negative impact in environment and the health public system. I was wondering, in a system which only values things that go with a number, how can we measure the results of all these public investments and all these positive and negative impacts in our system?
Great.
Okay.
So both really great questions, and thank you. I'll try to answer both quickly, because I can tell that we have a time pressure here. My fault, I spoke too much. So first, this issue of marketing, it's so nice, actually, to raise this in a business school setting. I mean, I know we're at the Guggenheim, but this wonderful event was organized and I think co-funded, co-sponsored by Deusto. And so usually when we think of marketing, right, we think of it literally as, you know, what comes to your mind with marketing in terms of marketing goods that are commercial. But how do we market? How do we, again, tell the story in terms of the communication strategy for an ambitious public investment? And I think, again, this is where you could help us, right? I mean, help us, but I mean the world to sort of understand both the good and the bad. Have you actually achieved it? You've had that public investment. You talk about your role, you know, with the Guggenheim. How have you communicated this to people? Because if it's not communicated, as soon as then some things start to go wrong, as they do, that's all they will remember. And it's really interesting with Brexit, the places that voted most Brexit were the poorest places that received the biggest benefits from the European Union. So Wales, all the infrastructure in Wales is funded basically, or not all of it, most of it, by the European Union. Massive failure of marketing, massive. There should have been big signs, and nice signs, not just the blue, you know, stars. There should have been, we made this, you know, like Obama's we built that speech. And it shouldn't just be, oh, we did this, we did that. It should be, yeah, we're doing this together, because you're part of the European Commission. You're paying into it. This is where your money goes. And by the way, it's very low, the amount of contribution per citizen. It's like a couple coffees a week or something. So, and even that wasn't communicated very well. The workers' rights, the environmental rights that many European countries have is because of the European Union. So massive failure of marketing. And so here, I don't know, you have to tell me, I'm unfortunately not an expert of the Basque region, but the degree to which your citizens understand the investments you're making, feel part of it, so it's not just the benign dictator. I'm not saying you're a benign dictator and I love you. No, but do you know what I mean? It's not just we did this for you, but we're doing this together. How you engage citizens, that matters as much as the marketing slogans, if you want. But the slogans matter too, and unfortunately there's not enough smart marketing people doing it. So I advise you, Alvaro, to open a marketing department around this issue. In terms of the last question, which was excellent, you know, it's interesting because GDP was not meant to do what it is doing. So part of it is it's kind of a problematic measure for the reasons I mentioned, that we're only including things with prices, hence the issue you raised. But actually, it wasn't meant to do that. It was really meant to be a más o menos thing, not to look at the 0.01%, the 1% increase or fall, and getting a whole nation to panic. And people say, oh, we need to be business friendly, and now let's just give away all these tax cuts to increase growth by that extra 2%, which then doesn't happen. It was meant to be kind of a thermometer in the system. So Kuznets very starkly warned against using GDP in the ways that we're using it today. What it should be used for, I think, we're not even using it for, like that broad trends in growth, like consumption-led versus investment-led, that's very good you can use GDP to do that, and yet we're not using it. If we were using it to do that, the whole UK would be really worried right now because they'd see we're not growing through investment, but through private debt-fueled consumption. But to do what you're saying, which is kind of the second point, which is, well, then what do we do actually? What other interesting measures? Some people have been talking about the need for indicators like wellness and well-being and happiness, and there's a whole agenda there, which I don't have to tell you about. It's very well documented. There was even the report by Fitoussi Sen, Amartya Sen, and Stiglitz. But I think what's really interesting, again, this is coming back to the issue of let's look on the experiments on the ground, learn from them, is this issue around outcomes-based budgeting. So the Jesuits had a good experience with this, and I learned about this through a colleague at the University of Edinburgh. They had a pot of money that they would need to spend on the things they wanted to spend on, and you needed two keys to open the pot of money. You needed the key of the rettore and the procuratore, so the accountant and the visionary at the same time. You couldn't access the money without having a vision and some sense of the accounting. But the accounting was almost a slave of the vision. Okay. And in Camden Council, where I live in London, which currently, by the way, is experiencing huge problems because after 10 years of austerity, the police were cut, mental health was cut, after school clubs, youth centers, public libraries, huge, the social fabric has kind of decimated. So for example, we have a big knife crime problem. The council, so a small part of London, through the work of people like Gemma Gould, have been thinking about outcomes-based budgeting in that kind of Jesuit sense, even though they don't know this Jesuit story. I'll have to go tell them about it. But so the idea is, what do we want to achieve? For example, zero knife crime? Zero. What are all the different investments we're going to need? Teenagers, 13-year-olds are killing themselves. It's new. This wasn't happening before. So you say zero. No more teenagers kill themselves in London. What do we need to do that? And you start saying, we're going to have to invest in the youth services, mental health. We're going to have to get new relationships between the police and the schools, et cetera. And then you say, what's the budget we're going to need to do that? And so you focus on the outcome, you focus on the result. That's a fundamentally different way that currently we run our governments, which is, here's a pot of money for education. See what you can do with it. And then the first thing is what we can't do. Cut the music, cut the arts, just do coding in English or something. So I think there's lots to learn from those experiments, as well as thinking of new growth measures that do account for the really fundamental things like caring. But caring itself should become a mission. A more caring society requires investment, innovation, in the same way that I said empathy from a politician requires training. You're not just born empathetic. You need to learn how to listen. That requires an investment. But that's only going to happen if you value listening. And listening is going to be crucial for how we form these missions in this co-created way versus just top-down, handed down. And just lastly, I think what's happened in Germany recently, where they had this Energiewende mission to really lower the material content across manufacturing, it would have never happened without the Green Movement, which for 30 or 40 years called for sustainability to come to the fore, and then being able to listen and to bring that into a government-led mission and have that cross-sectoral investment so that the steel sector has lowered its material content is an interesting story to learn from for other parts of Europe. So stop obsessing about the deficit, learn from these stories to make us richer in the real sense, not just in the quantitative sense.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting presentation, very interesting answers to the questions from the public, very inspiring answers, I would say. Thank you a lot, Professor Mazzucato, for this presentation, for all the passion you have shared with us. Very, very motivating session with all of us here. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. Gracias.
Claro.